Welcome to the London Politica podcast. This is where we join industry thought leaders and experts to uncover the nexus of politics, markets, and society. My name is Manas Chawla, and I'm so excited today to be joined by Ambassador Toro Hardy. He previously served as the Venezuelan Ambassador to the United States, the United Kingdom, Spain, Brazil, Singapore, Chile, and Ireland before resigning from the Venezuelan Foreign Service in protest for events taking place in his country. He's authored 21 books and co-authored 15 more on international affairs and history. His latest book, America's Two Cold Wars, From Hegemony to Decline, was published in 2022. Dr. Hardy, it is so wonderful to have you on the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, my pleasure.
So I had a good read of your book, and it was very, very fascinating. But I want to get to the sort of the core argument of it as soon as we can, and sort of unpack it from there as we go along. It seems to be your core argument is that whilst ideology was, a key fueling factor between the conflict with the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the previous Cold War, it seems like there's emerging a new Cold War between the U.S. and China. I'm wondering, especially with the context of the war in Ukraine, does that define more clearly the divide between democracy and autocracy for you? Will developments and ideological frameworks that have taken place since the start of the war, the way they shaped the emerging Cold War back then, will they shape the Cold War now between China and the US?
Well, indeed, ideology was the core element in the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. And that gave the US a crucial advantage as the birthplace of liberal democracy and its most devoted preacher. The United States was particularly well suited for a contest of ideologies. It was easy for Washington to claim the mantle of leader of the free world. Nothing would be more useful for the US nowadays in its fresh confrontation with China than a new ideological contest, as it happened during the First Cold War. This could provide a strong sense of purpose and much needed coherence in its actions. Not surprisingly, President Biden has become an ardent proponent of an ideological contest between democracy and authoritarianism, aiming at a fundamental debate between those who either believe in autocracy or democracy as the best way forward. However, America's liberal order has been invaded by the cancer of populism, and its basic norms are under threat at home itself. Hence, ideology is a non-starter for the US at this junction. Should Washington want to present its liberal credentials, it may be hampered by the fact that for many countries, according to the polls, the US democracy, it's not credible. Moreover, if ideology has become a non-starter for the US, promoting an ideological contest for China is a road to nowhere. Since Deng Xiaoping times, all that matters is that the cat catches mice. A straightforward social contract exists between the Communist Party and the Chinese people since Deng's time, which is, we'll make you better and you'll follow our orders. That bargain can endure as long as the regime keeps delivering. Delivering thus becomes the magic catchword. And Chinese accomplishment during these last 4 decades, which, by the way, have no precedent in recorded history, are a testament to it. Within this context, the authoritarian nature of China's regime is not tantamount to ideology, but to political culture. Is simply a political culture that dates back to the country's unification in 221 BC, at the time of the establishment of the Qin dynasty. As such, the Communist Party exists within a continuum with China's long dynastic history. Within it lies a Confucian culture in which the ruler is compared to an authoritarian father presiding over an extended family. Although war in Ukraine, as you mentioned, has and it represents a change, this has given a temporary lift to Biden's democracy versus autocracy debate. But the fact is that this doesn't change the fact that populism in America has profoundly eroded the country's liberal credentials, especially so as in 3 years' time, Washington could be again inaugurating another Trump administration. And this doesn't change the fact, neither, that for the Chinese, the cat has to keep catching mice, irrespective of ideologies.
I mean, the sense that I'm getting both from your answers and reading your book is that ultimately the U.S. is going to fare worse in this emerging Cold War than, suppose it did with the one in the Soviet Union. Instead of emerging from this conflict at the apex of the international system, the current conflict could well trigger its demise. I'm wondering, do you think, will China replace the US as global hegemon? How does China emerge from this conflict?
Well, I would say that during its first Cold War with the Soviets, the US had the wind at its back, with all the right configuration of factors supporting it. The playing field was the right one, meaning the core element, ideology, was its biggest strength. Its support base was large. There was an extensive network of alliances that reinforced its position. Its consistency of purpose was clear-cut, both domestically and externally. It followed a clear roadmap. The economic correlation between both superpowers worked on America's behalf. The US inhabited in the economic high ground. And the final objective was attainable, meaning the contention of the Soviet Union expansion. Hence, all these factors allow for a successful outcome. The problem being that at this time, the wind, it's blowing in the opposite direction, with America confronting the wrong configuration of factors, meaning the playing field doesn't favor it as its core underpinning element, its main weakness, meaning its capacity to deliver. The support base is faltering, as credibility among allies has reached a historical low. Although at this point in time, it has been temporarily halted due to Russia's invasion to Ukraine. The consistency of purpose is weak, as its political parties inhabit in different foreign policy planets, and its society is utterly polarized. The economic correlation puts it in a flickering place, as in a few years' time, the US will be sliding into the economic lowlands in relation to China. And the final objective the contention of China doesn't look as a reasonable proposition, because it wants to contain China in its own background and where it controls the theater of operations. On the other hand, China can excel in a context frame in terms of delivering results. Its international support base is it's wide. I would say it's much wider, as it has countless economic partners that have become stakeholders in China's success. Its economic strength will keep increasing with every passing year, and the notion of its containment looks unattainable. As a result, while the First Cold War ended up projecting the US to the pinnacle of the international system, this new Cold War could might just signal the transit from preeminence to decline. I would say that with such an auspicious outlook, common sense would advise that the US explores alternatives to Cold War with China. As Paul Kennedy has argued, the decline of American leadership is relative and not absolute. And the only serious threat that America faces that could accelerate that trend would come from its failure to adjust to a newer correlation of power. And if it fails to do so, it could indeed be that China emerges as the future hegemon.
As you say, Master Hardy, the likelihood that containment is a viable policy is increasingly, it doesn't seem like it might be a viable policy. But ultimately, the U.S. has to adopt some way to sort of manage and prevent the dwindling of its power, its demise from global hegemon. One of these possible ways you've written about is called constructive cohabitation. Constructive cohabitation with China. What would that look like in reality?
Well, my book assumes that global shared governance could benefit humanity as a whole. As none of the world most pressing challenges could be effectively addressed without cooperation between Washington and Beijing. It also assumes that conflict between both parties, it's a choice, not a necessity. And finally, it assumes as well that Washington's greatest challenge is embracing and managing the complexity of this relation. Hence, if both countries might become partners in solving some of the world's most pressing problems, if conflict is a choice and not a necessity, and if theirs is a highly complex relation whose main challenge consists in embracing and managing complexity itself, there should be much stuff to work upon. An agreement of this sort should lead to the US remaining as a major power in Asia, not the major, but as a major power in Asia, under a power sharing structure with China, while Washington accepts a larger global role for Beijing. If that were to be the case, Washington would have to negotiate a new distribution of political authority and influence to match the new distribution of power. But jointly, with being a power sharing structure, an agreement of this nature need that that the two sides adopt a flexible and nuanced approach. Kurt Campbell and Jack Sullivan have written a very interesting article at Foreign Affairs, in which they mention the Taiwan case as a model to follow In their view, Taiwan is the greatest unclaimed success in the history of the US and China's relation, one characterized by intense engagement, mutual vigilance, a degree of distrust, patience, and restraint. According to them, this should be the characteristic of a relation between both superpowers. Of course, needless to say that you need two for tango. And even if America turns out to be inclined to this kind of agreement, this would also require for China to be willing to accept a power sharing structure in its own background and in the world in general. And China might well be an unwilling tango partner, as it perceives itself to be precisely at the time of a big power pushover.
I want to sort of take forward that line as well of discussing, U.S. policy towards China. A recent stat I found was that in 2020, 73% of Americans polled by the Pew Research Center held a negative view on China. And of course, international relations, we see this sort of dual interplay, of public opinion driving foreign policy actions and of foreign policy actions and public diplomacy driving public opinion. I'm wondering, in the context of US-China relations, do you see one that's more dominant? Do you see public opinion driving foreign policy more than the reverse, say?
Well, at this point in time, the fact being that you don't have a foreign policy towards China in the US. You have a bashing attitude toward China. This could be described as attitude. This could be described as emotions, but it could not be described as a foreign policy strategy. What you are lacking is a foreign policy strategy. And it is very difficult to define a roadmap when you have two parties that inhabit in two different foreign policy planets, which is expression itself of an utterly polarized society where you have two societies that coexist side by side, demonizing each other and unwilling to accept each other. And under those bases, of course, there is a passion pushing attitudes that comes from below up to the top, but at the same time, that projects itself from the top to below, but neither of them implies or defines a foreign policy strategy towards China.
I think another key difference as well, I mean, insofar as we're talking about differences between, the old Cold War and the new one, is that in the old Cold War, one of the US's greatest strengths was its massive network of allies. And I think, US policies of sort of unilateralism and isolationism under Donald Trump, at least in part, if not majorly, are to blame for America really losing credibility among its allies. Like you said, it's at an all-time low. And the war in Ukraine is really, much of a sort of an outlier than it is part of the trend. Certainly, one of the key tenets of Biden's foreign policy is restoring these traditional alliances that's crumbled during the Trump presidency. I want your analysis on how effective he's been at that. Has he been successful at doing that? And has the war in Ukraine helped to strengthen those relations between the US and its allies in any way that might translate to the US's attitude towards China?
Well, the fact being that the US had a fantastic international architecture. After the World War II, the US built an international system that reinforced its own pushover, its own strength in relation to the Soviet Union. It worked exceedingly well. The US hegemony was based on the acquiescence of its many allies. And when the Soviet system imploded, that system became global. Against common sense, George W. Bush decided, or his administration decided, that this system didn't reflect the new correlation of power, according to which the US was the main power and needed to be respected by the rest. Hence, he simply deflected multilateral cooperativism, which has been the basis of this system that the US had constructed during years and years after the Second World War. And he defined a world in which everything was seen under the optic of with us or with it or against us. And of course, credibility among allies reached an historical low at that point in time. Afterwards, you had Obama that tried to reconstruct that international, the alliance system and US international credibility, and he was in good track to doing that because he insisted that the US should always be seen as the first among many, but not as the only one. The US would lead in a sort of way. And then when things were going in the right track, you had the arrival of Trump and his dog-eat-dog foreign policy, according to which if the top dog would always prevail, and hence if you promoted this kind of environment, the US would be on top, which of course was not the case, and that completely eroded trust in US leadership, as was stated by some of America's closer allies, as Angela Merkel in Germany, as Justin Trudeau in Canada, as Emmanuel Macron in France, and most of the allies who felt that they couldn't trust anymore the US. Now you have Biden, who has been trying to reconstruct these alliances, but you cannot reconstruct easily this kind of trust when in 3 years' time, as I was saying before, Trump can be back to power, and when the cancer of populism has invaded the America's democracy, suddenly this Russian invasion of Ukraine, has brought back the Atlantic Alliance, and there is now a coalition of about 40 countries that under America's leadership are confronting the Russian invasion and so on and so forth. But is this a new trend that arrived to stay? Is something that it's a temporary situation that may disappear soon? I definitely believe that this is a temporary situation because there are many questions still to be answered. One, what if the war prolongs itself? Two, what if the cost increases substantially? Three, what indeed if in a few months' time a new coalition in Congress in the US changes the actual climate? And of course, what if in 2 years' time Trump gets back to power? There are many situations that are contingent to America's internal situation, and at the same time contingent to an international ambience that it's very fluid itself. Marine Le Pen could have won a few days ago, and that would have changed the correlation. So the fact means that personally, I believe that that the essence of this lack of trust in the US will not disappear easily, although it has been pushed at this point in time due to the invasion of Ukraine.
I want to flip that sort of conversation a little bit, and maybe now start talking about China's policy and the way that it's made towards the U.S. Because I think a big difference is, I mean, if you look at the U.S. and you look at how foreign policy is made, even a cursory look, you'll sort of quite quickly realize that it's very, very complicated. Even more so than most Western countries. There's a very tenuous relationship between congressional influence and presidential power. Public opinion can often become very polarized. There's certainly sort of independent, national security organizations that all kind of, chip in and have a say. And then, at the very end, all of this policy changes regularly, at least every 4 or 8 years with, a new president. China's is very different to that. It's very centralized. With essentially, some might say Xi Jinping calling all the shots. That, clearly has some, advantages in terms of expediency and how efficient it is to do things. I'm wondering, what do you think are the biggest drawbacks of having such a centralized form of decision-making from China's perspective?
I would begin by comparing it with America's Cold War with the Soviet Union. I would say that Americans greatly benefited from the open nature decision-making system. Indeed, American democracy distributed the power to process information and make decisions among a plurality of people and institutions. Whereas the Soviet systems centralized information and power. So in America, you had free press, public debate, think tanks, lobbies, all of which allowed for the information to flow and be handled at different levels. Meanwhile, the division of the decision-making power in Washington facilitated the adequate management of huge amounts of information. On the other hand, you had the Soviet centralized system, which simply couldn't, which was centralized both information and decision-making. And hence, the system couldn't simply handle all that much information, which hampered perspective and adequate handling. Things have changed though since that moment. The diffusion of power to process information and make decisions that worked so well during the 20th century is now being outmatched for what at the time was a clear weakness, meaning centralization of data. Artificial intelligence has moved the pendulum in the opposite direction, not only because artificial intelligence allows to process countless amounts of information at astronomical speed, but because machine learning improves when it's fed with larger amounts of information. This is a subject that Israeli thinker Yuval Noah Harari has dealt with. And I think that as a result, what was considered as a strength of the US in its confrontation with the Soviets now works on behalf of a centralized system like the Chinese one. But on top of that, we have that Xi Jinping has become an autocratic figure in China. And you have to see what was the situation when he took power. There was a serious concern that the civilian leadership was losing control over the military. At the same time, the party was plagued by corruption, power struggles, and even by the threat of fragmentation. So Xi Jinping used his anti-corruption campaign not only to address corruption itself, but to push his rivals and the respective factions away. And well, this seems to have increased the efficacy of the regime in several ways. It has overcome the fracture of the political power that existed within it. It maintains the People Liberation Army uh, in tune with the party guidelines. And on the other hand, it has reconnected the party, the CCP, with the population, which is in tune with the prevailing nationalistic sentiments existing within the population. This, of course, translates into a clear-cut agenda, firm control of power, and the possibility of coordinated action through different levels of civilian and military leadership, and shared goals between the rulers and the ruled. But as you were mentioned, or the nature of your question was, what is the downside of it? And the downside of it. And of course, there is a fundamental downside. The longer Xi remains in power, the more the political structure will adapt to his personality and his objectives. This equates his person to the political stability of the country. A collective leadership implied an institutionalized system of ruling and succession. And this is lacking now, especially so because the sudden death of the core leader could create havoc in China at this point in time, as successions have created big problems in China in previous occasions. Especially so as the stability of the country depends on an overweight 68-year-old man with a history of smoking, who is a notorious workaholic, carrying on his shoulders the problem of 1.4 billion people. Hence, should he die suddenly, China might find itself in big trouble.
It seems clear to me from what you're saying that certainly, the way the path that China is on might well resemble, a few years down the line, the position that Russia is already in. You see Vladimir Putin, and not to make this entirely about sort of Russia, Ukraine, but the degree to which his decision making has been hampered by how centralized foreign policy making is, in Russia. I mean, there's internal reports as well of, everyone essentially just being yes men, no one really wanting to confront him when, military and tactical decisions he makes, they know are not very, tactical in the first place. So that's sort of, cult of personality can certainly damage institutions for, quite some time. And as you rightly point out, that could be a big problem. I also really loved your point about, Yuval Noah Harari and the centralization of data. I think there's so many emerging trends in China that are so worrying, and they come up at such a pace we can hardly keep track of them. But anything from facial surveillance to now the talk of a central bank backed digital currency. It seems like the government will have more and more information on its own citizens, and certainly if you look at past precedent, it doesn't look like it'll use that in a way that entirely conforms with sort of liberal democratic norms of human rights. I I also want to talk a bit about we a key difference in the old Cold War was a lot of it was about hard power. The narrative before that was about hard power, but this concept of soft power emerged almost directly as a response to that. Right? You couldn't quite explain the fall of the Berlin Wall through tanks and nuclear weapons, but you could explain it through Western influence and sort of this the attractiveness of Western culture in the hearts and minds of Soviet citizens. And I'm wondering how you feel that sort of soft power dynamic plays in this sort of emerging US-China relationship. And more specifically, I mean, is increasing its soft power and promoting its values and culture abroad, is that a foreign policy goal for China, would you say?
I would say that a few years ago, soft power was indeed a main foreign policy goal for China. But at this point in time, it's not. Assertiveness and what had been called wolf warrior diplomacy
Mm.
represent the nature of Xi Jinping's foreign policy today. And perhaps this needs some explanation. In the year 2004, the CCP, the communist regime, invited several dozen of Chinese intellectuals and scholars to meet at in Hainan Island to conceptualize a China brand, a soft power strategy that could be successfully promoted abroad. And from there, the concept of China's peaceful rise emerged, was coined. This notion was an attempt to project a very different rising track for China as the unsettling ones followed by Germany before World War I or by Japan before World War II. China's rise was not only to be peaceful, but to depend on reciprocity and win-win relations, etc. So it was a bright marketing strategy providing at giving Beijing, aiming at providing Beijing with goodwill, international goodwill dividends. And this was accompanied by a public relations strategy as well. You had the CCTV in English that was created, that was put in motion, and you have CCTV America, and you have the English coverage on China Radio International and in Xinhua. And of course, you had the creation of the Confucius Institutes that promptly proliferated around the world. This soft power strategy was particularly useful in relation to Europe. The European Union came to see China as a partner in its search for a peaceful and multipolar world. Some scholars in Europe even attributed to China 21st century qualities, mentioning that while its leaders preached a doctrine of stability and social harmony, its military talked more about soft power than hard power, and so on. But the year of 2008, though, was a turning point. It reflected an inflection point because, on the one hand, America's led world financial crisis and China's strengthening successfully overcoming contagion of that crisis convinced Beijing that America was not 10 feet tall, while they themselves were much taller than they had presumed. From that moment onwards, so far, soft power ceased to be a relevant goal for the Chinese, and they became much more assertive. And of course, more was to come when in 2013, Xi Jinping became president. He would substantially intensify his predecessor muscular foreign policy, and under his leadership, China has turned to be much more nationalistic and confrontational. China's current foreign policy complies with Hans Morgenthau's idea that the principal motive for political action is of three types: to keep power, to increase power, or to demonstrate power.
Hmm. Um, it's just so fascinating as well how you mentioned, China sort of employs soft power quite differently to the United States. You mentioned a couple of examples there. And what I can kind of extrapolate from that is the use of Chinese soft power is a lot more purposeful and top down and, state influenced and government led than, say the United States is. It seems like the Chinese insofar as, if they care about their soft power, they really care about crafting it in a way that's consistent with the political ideals that's set by, the top rungs of the political bureaucracy, very well by Xi Jinping. This talk about Confucius Institutes and the Belt and Road Initiative, whereas a lot of American soft power is organic, perhaps, or comes from its own cultural products, and I think for good reason, because of that, can become, can fluctuate a lot more as well, like we saw during Trump. So um, so certainly sort of a key part of it that we'll keep watching. Ambassador Hardy, just to close off, I want to ask you one question that I tend to ask most of my guests. Uh, what is there something in particular, kind of looking at U.S.-China relations going forward, is there something in particular that makes you optimistic about the future?
Unfortunately, this is not a good moment for being optimistic. I think that the situation has gotten more complicated in every front. Globalization, it's within a downward tendency. Liberal order is on the threat, and now you have this block in the making between China and Russia. I think this last issue is particularly worrisome, at least in relation to the US. This is something that the US should never have allowed to take shape. The US should never allow that these two countries coalesce in the way they have.
Hmm.
Of course, you cannot have anticipated this at the turn of the century, but since 2008 forward, the trend was clearly there. On the one hand, that year, Russia invaded Georgia because it wanted to make clear that it didn't want further encroachment of the Western world within its borders. And on the other hand, as I was mentioning before, China became much more assertive and confrontation. So after that point in time, the US should have approached the lesser of the two competitors, which clearly was China, which clearly was Russia, in order to try to build bridges. Actually, that's what Mao Zedong did in 1972 in relation with the US when he felt that war with the Soviet Union was a direct and immediate threat. Not having diffused one of these rivalries, now the US have to confront the two of them simultaneously. In the best case scenario, this will pose a huge distraction for the US in the long run, giving China a strategic opportunity that goes beyond its wildest dreams. But on the other hand, there is also the possibility that these two countries could coordinate their capability of response. So, whatever the case, in the global scenario, there are not all that many favorable issues, and the simple possibility that Trump could be back in power in 3 years is scarce. At least for me, it's a very scary proposition.
it's reason enough to be worried. Well, maybe if we'll have the discussion again in 3 years' time, we'll have a more sort of optimistic pathway forward if Trump isn't in power. But no, I really did enjoy this, and I think the conversation we had is part of this broader discussion that's going to be the defining discussion of the 21st century of U.S.-China. So it's one we're going to keep watching for a long time ahead. Ambassador Hardy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure. Very interesting conversation indeed.
Indeed, and to find out more about London Politica, please visit our website, londonpolitica.com, and follow us on LinkedIn. And that's all for this episode, folks. Stay tuned, stay safe, and I'll see you next week.